She had not slept in 3 days, not truly slept. Not the kind of sleep that restores a person, that smooths the lines of fear from a face and makes the world feel survivable again. She had collapsed, yes, twice, once against the base of an old pine tree with bark rough as a grater against her cheek, and once in a shallow ditch where the mud was cold enough to keep her awake before the cold itself became the enemy. But sleep, rest, peace, those were things that belonged to another woman. Dear woman she used to be. Her name was Clara Ashworth, though she had not been called by her maiden name in 4 years, and she was running for her life through 14 inches of fresh snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains, with nothing but a wool coat, a split lip and a wedding ring she could not bring herself to remove. The ring was not a symbol of love. It had never been. It was evidence. It was a chain worn on the finger instead of the wrist, and every time the pale winter light caught its gold band, it reminded her of what waited behind her, patient, methodical, certain of his own power. The kind of man who never hurried because he had never once doubted the outcome, but something had changed. She had changed, and the moment she had understood the full depth of what she was trapped inside, she had walked out through a kitchen door in the middle of a snowstorm and had not looked back. That was 72 hours ago. Now, as the last grey light of the afternoon bled out of the sky and the temperature began its merciless descent toward the single digits, she crested a ridge and looked down into a narrow valley she did not recognize, in a wilderness that had no sympathy for the unprepared. And there, through the timber and the gathering dark, was a single thread of smoke rising from a stone chimney. She did not know then what that smoke would mean. She did not know that the man tending that fire carried wounds as deep as her own, or that the mountain itself seemed to have conspired, across years, across grief, across silence, to bring them both to this exact moment. She only knew she was going to die if she did not reach that cabin. So she began to walk toward the light. His name was Elias Croft, and he had not spoken a voluntary word to another living soul in 11 months. He had come to the high country the way wounded animals come to still water, not with purpose, but with the last instinct of a creature who knows it must be alone to either heal or die. He had chosen this valley with its 30-foot winters and its wolf-frequented ridges precisely because the land did not ask anything of a man except honesty. The mountains did not require him to pretend. They did not offer condolences. They did not look at him with that particular softness in the eyes that he had come to associate with pity, and pity in those first months had felt more unbearable than the grief itself. He had built the second room onto the cabin in October, more out of restlessness than any expectation of use. He had notched the logs himself, mixed clay and pine resin into the chinking, and set a window frame facing east so that the winter sunrise would have somewhere to arrive. He could not have explained why. There was no one to fill that room. There had not been anyone for a very long time. He was splitting wood by lantern light when he heard it. Not the sound of the wind, which he knew the way a man knows the voice of a difficult neighbor, predictable, familiar, manageable. This was something else. A sound at the edge of his land, near the tree line where he had stacked the season's last cord of birch. A sound that did not belong to any animal he could name. He set down the axe. The lantern threw a long orange oval across the snow as he moved toward the edge of the clearing, and that was when he saw her, half standing, half collapsed against the old split-rail fence he had built in September, her coat the color of iron and her face the color of birch bark, her breath coming in shallow pulls that told him she was closer to the edge than she knew. He did not call out. He did not announce himself. He simply walked to her, and when she looked up at him with eyes that held no more room for fear because they were already full of it, he did the only thing that made sense on a mountain in January. He picked up the lantern and turned back toward the cabin. He did not say, "Come in." He did not say, "You will be safe here." He simply left the door open behind him, and after a moment he heard her footsteps in the snow, and then on the wooden step, and then on the threshold. That was how it began. He was not a man given to questions. Whatever he had been before the mountains, and there had been a before, a life with warmth and laughter, and a woman who called him by a name no one used anymore. He had learned in these 11 months that questions were a form of intimacy, and intimacy was a form of trust, and trust was a thing that had to be built like a stone wall. Slowly, deliberately, one piece at a time. So he did not ask her why she was running. He did not ask whose hands had split her lip or left that careful yellow-green bruise along her jaw in the shape of a grip. He fed her, dried elk and hardtack softened in broth, the same meal he made for himself every night, and he put a tin cup of pine needle tea beside her plate because it had vitamin C in it, and she looked like someone who had not eaten a warm meal in at least 3 days. She ate everything. That told him more than any question could have. While she sat near the fire, wrapped in the bear hide blanket he kept by the hearth, he made the second room habitable. He had a spare wool pallet from a trading post run in November, and he moved it to the plank bed frame he had built in October, and he set a candle on the shelf above it, and he left the door between the rooms open just enough to share the heat. She had fallen asleep before he finished. He stood in the main room for a long time after, listening to her breathe, still shallow, still scared even in sleep, still braced against a blow that was not coming. Not here. Not while the snow was 4 feet deep on the north face, and the temperature was falling, and there was not a horse alive that could make it up his pass after dark. He poured himself a cup of the pine tea he did not want, and sat in the chair by the fire. And the fire said nothing, and the mountain said nothing, and he was grateful for both. It was only then, in the quiet, that he let himself see it. The thing he had noticed immediately and had filed away without examination, the ring, plain gold, worn close to her second knuckle in the way that rings worn for years eventually sit. The ring of a married woman, the ring of a woman running from a marriage. He understood something about things that could not be undone. He understood what it meant to carry evidence of a life that had not turned out to be what it promised. And he understood, in the particular bone-deep way of a man who had lost everything he loved in a single winter afternoon, that some wounds did not need to be named in order to be real. He did not sleep that night. He fed the fire every 2 hours, and sometime around 3 in the morning, when the wind picked up from the northwest and the cabin groaned along its seams, he heard her cry out once, not loudly, just a short, sharp sound, as if something had startled her from inside the dream, and then go quiet again. He sat very still and let the fire keep burning. Morning came the way it always did in January, slowly, grudgingly, with the quality of pewter light that made the world look like it was made of the same material as regret. The snow had not stopped. It fell in fine, dense curtains that erased the tree line and turned the valley into a single pale field of silence. Clara woke to the smell of wood smoke and rendered fat and the distant rhythmic sound of an axe meeting wood, steady and unhurried, like a clock that had never broken. She lay still for a long moment. She could not remember the last morning she had woken without first locating the sound of his breathing in the room, without calculating distance, mood, risk. It was a habit so deeply worn into her body that it had become involuntary, a heartbeat, a reflex, a survival function she had not chosen. There was no breathing to locate here. There was only the axe and the fire and the snow. She rose and wrapped the bear hide around her shoulders and moved to the main room, and through the single east-facing window, the one that looked toward the ridge where the sun would eventually climb, she could see him. A tall man, broad through the shoulders, working at a woodpile with the focused economy of movement of someone who had done this so many thousands of times. That thought was no longer required. Just the body and the axe and the wood. She watched him for a moment before he noticed her, and in that brief unguarded interval, she saw something she had not expected. A scar that ran from his left jaw down beneath the collar of his coat, pale against his weathered skin, healed long ago, but permanent. Evidence of something survived. She had not thought when she fell against that fence the night before that she might have stumbled into the company of someone who also knew what it was to be marked. He came in without ceremony, stomped the snow from his boots, and set a fresh load of wood by the hearth without looking at her directly. He put water on for oats and set out 2 bowls, and that simple act, the placement of 2 bowls, as a matter of course, without discussion, did something unexpected to the careful stillness she had been maintaining inside her chest. She sat down at the table. He sat down across from her. They ate in silence, and the silence was not hostile. It was the silence of 2 people who had both learned, at great cost, that words are not always what is needed. When she finished, she looked up at him, and he was already looking at her, not with the measuring look of a man calculating what she was worth, or the careful look of a man managing a problem. He was looking at her the way you look at something you have seen before in a dream, uncertain whether the recognition is real or a mercy your mind has invented. She set her spoon down. She told him her name was Clara. Nothing more. He told her his name was Elias, nothing more. And the mountain held its breath and waited to see what the two of them would do with that. The first week passed in the grammar of survival. There was no space for anything else. The storm that had been building since her arrival delivered 3 feet of new snow in 4 days, and the world outside the cabin's walls ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. There was only the work, keeping the fire, managing the stores, maintaining the gap in the snow around the chimney to prevent carbon buildup, checking the structure of the roof under the weight of the accumulation. Elias had his systems. Years alone had refined them into something that functioned like a second nervous system, automatic, precise, anticipatory. He knew how much wood lasted how many hours at each temperature. He knew how to read the sound of the wind for what it intended. He knew how to live in this place the way a good carpenter knows a piece of lumber, its grain, its tendencies, its limits. What he did not know was what to do with someone else inside those systems. Clara was not what he had expected. He was not certain what he had expected. A useless burden, perhaps, a liability he would be paying down with extra firewood and divided rations until the thaw made it possible to send her down the mountain. What he found instead was someone who watched him work with absolute attention on the first day, asked no unnecessary questions, and by the second day was doing a quarter of the tasks without being asked. She did not know the mountain's specific vocabulary. She did not know to bank the coals in a particular way, or how to test the snow on the roof by sound rather than sight. But she learned with a speed that told him she was not a woman unacquainted with hard work. Her hands, when she held them near the fire, were not the hands of a pampered woman. There were calluses, old ones. There was competence in the way she moved through domestic labor, not fragility, not helplessness. Just a woman whose competence had, for a long time, been used against her. He noticed things he did not wish to notice, the way she flinched at sudden sounds, even small ones, the crack of a log settling in the fire, the bang of the shutter in the wind, the way she always positioned herself with a wall at her back when she sat, the way she tracked the cabin door without appearing to. The body remembers what the mind is still trying to forget. He knew this. He had his own catalogue of things his body remembered without his permission. By the 5th day, she had organized his supply shelf in a way that made twice as much sense as his own arrangement, and he had stood in front of it for a long moment before he understood why. And he had not said anything, but he had not changed it back. On the 6th day, she found his medical kit, a tin box in the back corner of the supply shelf, and without asking, took inventory of what was depleted and what remained, and set aside the items that needed replacing come spring. She had worked with the precision and knowledge of someone trained in it, moving through the contents with hands that knew exactly what they were handling. He asked her, because it was the first question he had asked, and it cost him something to ask it, where she had learned that. She told him, without looking up from the tin box, that she had trained as a nurse's aide before she was married, that she had been good at it, that she had been told when she married that a woman with a husband had no need of a trade. The way she said it was not bitter, it was simply factual, the way a person states a thing that happened so long ago the wound has calcified. But the fact itself, that someone had taken a skill, a purpose, an identity, and told her it was unnecessary, sat in the room between them like a third presence. He said nothing. But the next morning, when he was working on the far side of the woodpile, and she brought him a tin cup of the pine tea without being asked, he accepted it and drank it. And that was a form of language between them that required no translation. It was on the 9th day that the trouble almost found them for the first time. She had been outside, using the clear interval between snowfalls to pack snow around the cabin's lower logs as insulation, a task he had shown her without ceremony, the kind of maintenance that the mountain demanded, and did not forgive the neglectful for ignoring. She was working the north wall when she heard it. Horses, far off but not impossibly far, on the lower trail, where the main pass crossed the saddle of the ridge. She was inside the cabin before she had made any conscious decision to move. The door latched behind her. her back against the wall beside the window, with her breath held and her hands very still. He had heard it too. He was already at the window, his big frame very still, watching the tree line with the particular quality of attention that is not alarm, but is the thing that precedes it. The horses did not come closer. After a long while the sound faded. Travelers on the lower trail perhaps, or a supply party heading for one of the mining claims to the east. But she did not breathe normally again for the rest of that day. And in the evening, when they sat on either side of the fire, he looked at her across the space between them and said quietly, with the particular economy of a man who chooses each word as deliberately as a stone placed in a wall, that whoever was looking for her would not find her here. That the trail above the upper saddle had been blocked by the slide he'd triggered in November. Intentionally, he did not bother to deny it. And that there was no route to this valley that a stranger could navigate in winter without knowing exactly where to step. She looked at him for a long moment. She asked him why he had told her that. He said it was simply the truth, and the mountain required honesty. She turned back to the fire, and after a while she said in a voice so quiet it was nearly just the sound of a thought, that she had spent 4 years inside a house where the truth was the most dangerous thing possible, where a true answer to a simple question could mean a split lip or a week of silence that was somehow worse. She said she had almost forgotten what honesty felt like from someone who was not using it as a weapon. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said he understood something about houses where silence was safer than speaking. He did not say more, but the fire between them seemed to burn with a different quality after that, not warmer exactly, but steadier. The kind of fire that has found its oxygen and intends to keep burning. The storm returned with a fury that made the first one seem like a rehearsal. It came down from the northwest on the 18th day, and it came without the gradual courtesy of an approaching system. It arrived all at once, the way catastrophe does, without warning and without mercy. And inside 2 hours the visibility outside the cabin walls had dropped to nothing, and the temperature with it. By nightfall, the thermometer that Elias kept nailed to the exterior wall of the porch read 31 below zero. In weather like that, the cabin became a different kind of universe. Everything contracted. The world outside ceased to matter because it could not be reached and could not reach them, and the only reality was the circle of orange warmth thrown by the hearth and the 600 square feet of notched log and clay chinking that stood between them and the absolute cold. It was in that contracted universe that things began to shift, not dramatically, not with the force of a declaration or a revelation, but in the way that all genuine things shift, incrementally, in small gestures, in moments where the guard drops without the person being aware it has dropped. She had taken to sleeping with the connecting door fully open, because the cold seeped through the second room's wall faster than the main hearth could compensate, and the warmth shared between them kept both spaces survivable. He had not commented on this arrangement. He had simply added a second log to the evening fire. They had begun to talk, not about the important things, not yet, but about the surface things that are always the practice runs for the important ones. She told him about the mountains she had grown up near, in a different range farther south. He told her about the seasons in this particular valley, their personalities, their moods. She asked about the scar on his jaw. He told her briefly about a logging accident in his 23rd year. She asked nothing further, and her restraint was a courtesy he did not miss. He told her one evening that there was a meadow on the east face of the ridge above them that became, in July, a field of Indian paintbrush so dense it looked like the mountain had been set on fire in a benevolent way. He had not told anyone about that meadow since, and here he paused briefly, in the way a person pauses at a threshold they were not certain they intended to cross, since his wife had died. The word landed softly. She did not offer condolences. She did not perform the face that he had come to dread. She simply said that it sounded like exactly the kind of place that deserved to be remembered, and something behind his eyes, some particular quality of tension that had been there since she arrived, and perhaps longer than that, eased. He had lost his wife 18 months ago. Not suddenly, which in some ways would have been kinder, but in the slow, consuming way of an illness that takes longer than the watching of it should require. He had sat with her through 2 winters and a summer, in a house in a valley town 30 miles from where he now lived, and he had learned in that time what love looked like, stripped of everything but its core. Not romance, not ease, not the life they had imagined together, but simply the willingness to remain, to stay, to be present for every difficult day without requiring it to be beautiful. When it was over, he had not been able to remain in that house for reasons he could not have articulated and had never tried to. He had sold what he could, given away what he couldn't carry, and walked up into the high country with enough supplies to survive a winter, and no particular expectation that surviving it would feel like a victory. He had survived it anyway, and then another one, and now he was in the middle of his third, and there was a woman in his second room who carried her own damage, with the particular dignity of someone who has learned that the wound does not define the carrier, and somehow, in the midst of the 31 below zero storm that had sealed the world outside into silence, he realized that the cabin had stopped feeling like a place of exile. He was not certain when that had happened. He was not certain what to do with the knowing. She, for her part, was doing something she had not done in 4 years. She was thinking about the future, not in the catastrophizing way of the past 4 years, where the future was only a series of contingencies to survive. Not in the careful, strategic way she had learned to think about it, mapping risks and exits and escape routes. She was thinking about it in the older way, the way she had thought about it before her marriage, when the future was simply a country you were traveling toward and you did not know all its geography yet, but you trusted that when you got there, it would have room for you. She thought about the meadow on the east face. She thought about July. She thought that perhaps she would still be here in July. And then she caught herself thinking it, and the thought was so unfamiliar, so full of a kind of hope she had not allowed herself to feel, that it made her chest ache in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. The storm broke on the 21st day. The morning it did, the world outside was so brilliantly, painfully white that looking at the snowfields directly was like looking into something sacred. The sky was the particular blue that only exists at altitude and only after a major storm, a blue that seemed to have been purified by the cold into something unreachable by ordinary sky. Elias came inside after checking the roof and the exterior structure, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, stamping the snow from his boots, and he looked at her where she sat at the table with the tin medical box open in front of her. She had been reorganizing it again, a habit she had developed in the storms, cataloguing and recataloguing as a way of keeping her hands useful. And he said the trail above the saddle would be impassable for at least another 6 weeks, possibly 8. She looked up at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them said what they were both in their separate and guarded ways, thinking that 6 weeks had begun to sound less like a delay and more like a gift. The trouble found them sooner than either of them had feared. It came on the 31st day, in the form of a man on a bay horse picking his way up the lower trail with a patience and methodical determination that spoke of someone accustomed to tracking. He did not come alone. There were 2 others behind him, bundled against the cold, and the third man carried something long across his saddle that caught the winter light in a way that required no interpretation. Elias saw them from the high ground first, checking the upper ridge for the snow stability that the post-storm warming always threatened. He watched them for a long time from a position that gave him visibility without exposure, and what he saw told him several things, none of them welcome. These were not lost travelers. They were not miners or trappers using the lower trail for transit. They had stopped at the tree line below his valley and were studying the approach the way men study an objective rather than a destination. He came down fast. She was inside, rendering fat at the fireplace, when he came through the door, and the quality of his entrance, the particular controlled speed of a man who has decided on a course of action, told her everything before he spoke. He did not ask her if she knew who they were. He could see in the way the blood had left her face that she did. He asked her instead how long they had been tracking her. She told him, and her voice was very steady, steadier than he had expected. The steadiness of a woman who had spent 4 years preparing for the worst and was now in the strange position of not facing it alone, that her husband was not a man who stopped, that he had resources and patience and a quality of certainty about ownership that did not recognize other people's refusals, that he would have hired men in the first town below the snow line, given them her description and the direction she had been seen traveling, and told them to bring her back. He had not, she said, ever in 4 years let anything of his leave without being retrieved. Elias looked at her for a moment, and then he said that no man owned the mountain's guests. It was not a grand declaration. He said it in the same tone he used to discuss the week's supplies or the evening fire, with the same flat certainty with which he stated any fact about this place and its workings. But the word guests, not stray, not problem, not burden, did something to the air in the room that both of them felt. He told her what they were going to do. He had a plan that had nothing to do with confrontation and everything to do with the mountain's own grammar, the landforms and sightlines, and the particular acoustics of the valley that he had been learning for 3 winters. The men below did not know this valley. They did not know its hidden approaches or the way sound traveled in the draw between the eastern cliffs. They did not know about the secondary structure, an old trapper's cache 300 yards into the timber on the north side, invisible from the trail, that could shelter one person through a night of sub-zero cold if that person knew where it was and had the supplies to maintain a fire. He sent her there with the bear hide and a pack he assembled in 4 minutes, with the efficiency of a man who had prepared for this eventuality, at some level, since the night she appeared at his fence. She went without argument, which told him something about her trust that he set aside to consider later, when there was time for consideration. He went back to his cabin and opened the door and lit every lamp he had and put water on for coffee, and when the 3 men came up the final rise and into his yard, he was sitting on the porch step in the cold as if he had all the time in the world and nothing particular to hide. They told him they were looking for a woman. His wife, said the man at the front, and the man's eyes were careful and professional and empty of anything that resembled actual concern, had wandered from home in distress during the storm. The family was worried. Elias looked at them with the expression of a man so accustomed to solitude that the arrival of 3 strangers represented primarily an inconvenience. He said he had seen no one. He said it without elaboration, without the over-explaining of someone performing innocence. He said it the way the mountain said things, plainly, finally, without apology. The men pressed. They asked about the second room. They asked about the supplies. The lead man's eyes moved across the cabin's exterior with a cataloguing attention that was not the curiosity of the innocent. Elias said that a man's cabin was his own, and that the mountains had weather enough without strangers adding more. There was a long moment when anything might have happened. The kind of moment that has weight, that is felt in the body before the mind catches up to it. And then the lead man looked at his companions, and there was a consultation in that look, silent, calculating, and he said very quietly that the woman's husband was a man who remembered favors and debts. Elias said he did not keep accounts. The 3 men left as the sun dropped behind the western ridge, picking their way back down the trail, with the particular economy of movement of people who have not given up, but have decided to regroup. He watched them until they disappeared below the tree line, and then he went to the north timber to bring Clara home. She had spent the hours in the trapper's cache in a state of stillness that was not peace but was something adjacent to it, the stillness of a person who has surrendered the illusion of control and is waiting to see what survives without it. She had built the smallest fire that could produce meaningful heat, and she had sat with her back against the log wall, and she had let herself, for the first time, understand the full weight of what she was inside. Not just the running, not just the fear, the full story of it, how it had begun so quietly, so reasonably, with small corrections and small withdrawals, with kindnesses that had conditions attached to them that only became visible when the conditions were not met. How she had spent 2 years being slowly convinced that her own perceptions were untrustworthy. How she had spent another year understanding what was happening, and another year after that gathering the courage that a warm kitchen and a locked front door made extremely difficult to gather. She had walked out through the kitchen door in a snowstorm because the snowstorm was the first opportunity in 4 years that she had recognized as genuinely hers. She did not regret it. She only regretted that she had not had this kind of stillness to think in earlier. That it had taken a trapper's cache in 30 below weather to give her the silence that her own mind had never, for 4 years, been permitted to have. When Elias came through the timber and she heard his footsteps in the snow, steady, unhurried, already familiar as a signature. She felt the particular quality of relief that comes not from rescue, but from return. She was not being fetched. She was not being managed. He was simply walking back to where she was, because that was the natural direction of his attention. They did not speak much on the walk back to the cabin. The cold made conversation effortful, and the dark made it unnecessary. But at one point, crossing the flat below the eastern cliffs where the snow was unmarked and the stars were the only light, and the silence was absolute, she reached out and put her hand briefly on his arm. He did not say anything. He simply did not move away. It was enough. It was more than enough. The men came back. Not on the 32nd day, or the 33rd. They waited, as patient and methodical as she had promised they would be, until the 10th day after their first visit, when a brief thaw had opened the trail above the saddle, enough to allow passage with the right horses. They came in the grey hour before dawn, which is when people who intend harm come, the hour when the human body is at its lowest, and the will is at its most fragile. But Elias was not sleeping. He had not slept deeply since their first visit. He was a man who had survived 3 hard winters through the particular discipline of attention, the knowledge that the mountain's dangers do not announce themselves, and that preparation is the only true luxury available at altitude. He had spent the 10 intervening days thinking, observing, and making quiet arrangements. He had gone down the north side of the ridge on the 3rd day after their visit, before the thaw, through a route in the timber that a stranger would need weeks to find, and he had spoken to old Martin Greaves, who ran a small ranch in the Hanging Valley 3 miles north, and who had been in this country since before Elias was born. Martin Greaves was not a man of many words, but he was a man whose word was absolute, and when Elias told him what he needed and why, the old man had looked at him for a long moment, and then said he had a nephew who was a deputy marshal in the county seat, and that there were people in this world who had abused their advantages of money and position for long enough. He had given Elias a letter. That letter, in the inside breast pocket of his coat, was the piece that the men coming up the trail before dawn did not know about. They came into the yard at 4 in the morning, the 3 original men and 1 additional one, and the 4th man was the one who frightened her most, not because of his size or his weaponry, but because she recognized him from the house. He was her husband's factor, the man who managed the practical details of his affairs, and his presence here meant that her husband had decided this was a matter that required a reliable representative. She heard them from inside, and she was already dressed, already standing by the eastern wall with the bare hide across her shoulders and her chin level, because she had made a decision in the trapper's cache that she had not yet articulated, and that she articulated now in the silent language of her own spine and shoulders. She was done being the thing that happened to other people. She was done being managed and retrieved and decided about. Elias opened the door before they knocked. He stepped out onto the porch with the letter in his hand. He told them in his flattest and most final voice that the letter in his hand was addressed to the Deputy United States Marshal for the district and outlined certain information regarding a woman brought to his care who showed evidence of injuries consistent with a sustained pattern of violence, injuries that Clara had allowed him to document because she was a woman with a nurse's training and she knew exactly what documentation meant and what it was worth, and that this letter had already been placed with Martin Greaves, who would carry it to the county seat at first light if Elias did not return to collect it personally by noon. He said this in the same tone in which he said everything. There was a very long silence. The factor was a man who understood leverage. It was his profession. He understood in the silence following Elias's words that the leverage had shifted and that he was now standing on the wrong side of it. A deputy marshal's investigation into a man of means was not a thing that could be quietly extinguished. It had the quality of a fire that spread sideways rather than up, through reputation, through society, through the careful architecture of standing that men like his employer spent lifetimes constructing. The factor looked at Clara, who was standing in the doorway behind Elias. She looked back at him without flinching. He said that his employer would not accept this outcome. Elias said that his employer was welcome to explain his objections to the United States Marshal, who was a man with a notable lack of tolerance for explanations that included the word ownership in the context of a wife. The factor looked at him for a long time, and then he said to the man behind him that they were leaving. They filed back down the trail in the grey pre-dawn, 4 men and 4 horses, and Clara stood on the porch and watched them go until the last sound of hooves had faded into the silence of the valley, and then she stood there a little longer because the silence itself felt new. It felt like the first silence she had owned in 4 years. Elias stood beside her. He did not say anything. He simply remained where he was, solid and without apology, in the cold before dawn until the silence had enough time to settle into something permanent. The letter did reach the marshal. It was the beginning of a formal proceeding that would take months to resolve, conducted in an office 30 miles from the mountain, with documents and testimonies and the kind of slow institutional justice that is deeply unsatisfying in the moment and deeply necessary across time. Clara would eventually sign her own name to a deposition that cost her something and freed her from something else, and the man she had married would spend a long time discovering the precise dimensions of what Elias Croft had meant when he said he did not keep accounts in the currency of favors and debts. But that was the world of courts and testimony and institutional machinery, and it moved at the pace of those things. On the mountain, time moved differently. The thaw came, as it always did, in a series of false starts. A week of warmth in March that retreated overnight into cold, as if the mountain were testing the valley's patience. Then a longer warm spell in April that meant business, and with it the first mud and the first birdsong and the first tentative appearance of green at the base of the southern-facing slopes. Clara did not go down the mountain in the spring thaw. There was no dramatic announcement made about this. There was no conversation that resolved itself into a declaration. There was simply the morning in early April, when the lower trail was passable and they both knew it, and they went about the morning's work in the way they had been going about the morning's work for 3 months, and no one proposed departure, and no one asked about it. And by the time the sun was high enough to mean something, the question had been answered in the only way that questions of that magnitude can be answered, through the accumulated weight of small daily choices made in the same direction. She had written to a woman in Sacramento who had been a friend before her marriage, a letter that took her 3 days to compose and that she had given to Martin Greaves to post, and the reply had come back in May with a warmth that told her that the world she had left behind had not forgotten her and had not judged her and was still, in its imperfect way, a place that had room for her. She had written back that she was staying where she was, at least for now, and that she was learning things she had not expected to learn, and that she was, in ways she did not entirely have language for yet, more herself than she had been in a very long time. She found in the spring that she had opinions about the cabin that she had not felt entitled to express during the winter. She found that Elias, who had built every inch of this place with his own hands, was not a man who experienced someone else's suggestions as a challenge to his construction. He was, instead, a man who had been building for one person for so long that he had genuinely not considered all the dimensions of building for 2. They expanded the porch. It was Clara's idea, and it was practical. A wider overhang gave more dry wood storage and more cover for the morning work. But it was also, in the way that all genuinely domestic acts are, more than practical. They worked on it together over a week, side by side, and she learned to use a mallet on the chiseling work, and he learned to accept help without directing every motion, and both of these things were harder than they looked, and more important than they seemed. On a Thursday in late May, while they were working on the final rail section of the new porch, Clara went still. He noticed. He had become very good at noticing. She was looking at the small wooden box on the shelf inside the open cabin door, the one that had been there since winter, that she had never asked about, with the small carved initial on its lid that was not his initial. He had seen her look at it before, with the careful courtesy of someone choosing not to intrude. But today she was looking at it with a different quality of attention. He set down his tools. He told her his wife's name had been Margaret, that she had been a woman who found joy in small, specific things, the sound of pine jays, the smell of coffee on cold mornings, the weight of a book in her hands, that she had loved this mountain, even though she had only seen it in photographs he had sent from his early surveys, that he had brought her here in the box on the shelf because it had seemed like the right place, the place that was most entirely itself. He said that he had talked to her, that first winter, every day. That he had stopped sometime in the autumn because it had started to feel less like grief and more like a refusal of something. That he thought she would have found that refusal unreasonable, knowing her. Clara looked at the box for a moment. She said that Margaret sounded like someone who knew what mattered. He said yes, she had. Clara said quietly that she hoped she was somewhere with pine jays. He looked at her, and there was something in his face that had not been there in October, and perhaps not even in February. A specific, careful openness that is not happiness exactly, but is the country that borders it. The country a person reaches when they have decided that the risk of being open is less than the cost of remaining closed. He did not say the thing that was in his expression, but she saw it, and he saw her see it, and that was its own form of language. She reached over and put her hand over his briefly on the rail they had been building. His hand was rough and large and warm from the work, and her hand was smaller and similarly calloused, and they stayed that way for just a moment before returning, each of them, to the work. The porch was finished by the end of that week. They ate dinner on it the first evening, watching the sun go down behind the western ridge, and the valley below them was full of the particular gold-green light of a high-country evening in late spring, and the Indian paintbrush on the east face was not yet in bloom, but the new growth was visible. Orange tips on the meadow grass that promised what was coming. She asked him about Margaret again that evening, not probing, not seeking, simply asking, the way you ask about the things that made a person who they are, because the person in front of you has become worth understanding entirely. He told her more than he had told anyone. The way they had met, at a surveying camp where her brother had worked, where she had arrived with lunch in a tin pail and had made him laugh within 30 seconds of introduction, which was, he said, a feat. The early years of their marriage, when they had lived in the valley town and he had worked timber, and she had worked a kitchen garden that fed half the street. The last years, which he described not with the particular reverence that grief sometimes performs, but with the honest acknowledgement of someone who had lived through something difficult and come out the other side not destroyed, but indelibly marked. He said that loving someone through their worst time did not make you a saint. It made you a person who understood better than most what love actually required. Clara was quiet for a long time after that, and then she said that she wanted to tell him something about herself, about before the marriage, about the woman she had been, the nurse's aide with the quick hands and the opinions about medical organization, and the friends in Sacramento, and the plans, modest and specific, that she had been building toward in her 23rd year before a charming and plausible man had redirected her whole understanding of her own future. She told him about that woman. She told him what it had felt like to watch that woman diminish by degrees over 4 years, not in one catastrophic moment, but in the steady, incremental way of erosion, where each individual loss seems survivable, and it is only looking back from a distance that you see the shape of the canyon. She said that she was still finding pieces of herself, up here, that she was not the same woman who had climbed this mountain on 3 days of no sleep, that she was becoming someone she was not entirely familiar with yet, but that the unfamiliarity felt like possibility rather than danger, and that was entirely new. He listened to all of it without interruption, without commentary, without the various forms of redirection that people use when they are uncomfortable with another person's pain. When she finished, the sun had been down for 20 minutes, and the stars were beginning their slow declaration. He said that the woman she was describing, the nurse's aide with the opinions and the plans, was still clearly present. He had watched her work. He knew her hands. She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh without restraint, without the brief checking that usually preceded it, the small internal audit that asked whether it was safe. It was a real laugh, complete, without apology. It changed the quality of the evening. It changed something in him too, that he would examine later with the same careful attention he gave the mountain signs, looking for what it meant, what it required, what it predicted. It was 10 days later, on a morning in early June, when the high country was finally tentatively coming into itself. The snow receded to the very peaks, the lower meadows green and loud with the creeks running, that Martin Greaves arrived on his roan horse with a young man behind him. The young man was his nephew, the deputy marshal. He had ridden up to tell Clara in person that the formal proceedings were concluded, that a judge in the county seat had received the documentation, reviewed the testimony, and made a determination. That the man she had married was not a man who would be extending a reach toward her again without facing consequences that his money could not entirely prevent. That she was, in the fullest legal sense available to the law of that territory, free. He said this plainly as the law is plain, without flourish. Clara stood on the new porch and listened, and her face did not perform anything particular. It simply absorbed. The way dry ground absorbs the first good rain, completely without drama, as if it had always known this was coming and had only been waiting for the correct season. She thanked him. He tipped his hat and rode back down with Martin Greaves, and their horses' hoofbeats faded into the sound of the creek, and the June morning went on being a June morning. Birds, water, the smell of warming pine, the distant blue of the high peaks still holding their last white. Elias was standing in the yard when she turned from watching the riders go. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. She said, she supposed she was free to go wherever she chose. He said, she was. She said she had been thinking about the East Meadow, the one with the Indian paintbrush. She had been thinking that she would very much like to see it in bloom. He said, it would be blooming in another 3 weeks or so. She said, then she would stay until it bloomed. He said after a moment, and after that. She said, she supposed that would depend on a number of things. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was processing something that required more time than the conversation was giving it. And then he said, with the particular plainness of a man who had learned that the truth, properly spoken, was the only real courtesy, that he hoped the number of things she was depending on included him. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, they did. The East Meadow bloomed on the 15th of July. She saw it at dawn from the ridge above, spread across the bowl of the meadow, in a density of orange-red that seemed impossible, that seemed like something the mountain had been planning all year specifically for this revelation. The individual flowers blurred at this distance into a single blazing presence, and the early light from the east came across the ridge and found them all at once, and the whole meadow appeared to be on fire with something benevolent and ancient. She stood there for a long time. She thought about Margaret, who had loved this mountain through photographs. She felt no jealousy, no discomfort, only a kind of tender solidarity. The solidarity of women who had loved the same person in different seasons, and who understood that love is not a finite thing that must be divided, but an expanding one that makes room. She thought about the kitchen door in the snowstorm, the decision that had looked from inside the house like the most terrifying thing in the world, and had turned out to be the first honest thing she had done in 4 years. She thought about how the body carries what the mind cannot yet hold, the flinch at a sudden sound, the back against the wall, the tracking of doors. She thought about how slowly those things heal, and how the healing is not a straight line, but a kind of relearning, done in small moments and quiet mornings, and the gradual discovery that a certain pair of footsteps no longer activates the alarm that other footsteps once did. She thought about the porch they had built together. She heard his footsteps in the grass below the ridge, steady, unhurried, familiar as a signature, and she did not turn immediately. She let herself have one more moment of the meadow, with its impossible color and its morning light, and then she turned, and he was coming up the slope with 2 tin cups of coffee and his face in the clear mountain light, and she felt the thing she had been allowing herself incrementally to feel since April, and this time she let herself feel it completely. It was not complicated. It was the simplest thing in the world, which is the hardest thing to find. He handed her the tin cup. She took it with both hands. They stood together in the East Meadow as the sun came fully over the ridge, and the Indian paintbrush burned around them in its annual declaration of impossible abundance, and the valley below was a country they both knew and had both separately earned. He said, "You never took off the ring." She looked at her hand. The gold band, the evidence. She said, "I know." She looked at it for a moment, and then she took it off carefully and held it in her palm and looked at it in the morning light, not with hatred, not with ceremony, but with the clear-eyed honesty of someone examining a fact about their own history. She set it at the base of an Indian paintbrush, in the dark mountain soil where it caught the light and then was still. She did not explain this. She did not need to. He did not comment on it. He did not need to. They drank their coffee in the blazing meadow, and the sun went on rising, and the mountain went on being the mountain. Indifferent to small human dramas, and yet, in its way, generous to those who learn to live honestly within its terms. 9 months later, on a morning in the following April when the snow was still deep on the north face, but the south-facing slopes were already beginning to consider spring, a child was born in the cabin on the eastern ridge of the Sierra Nevada. The birth was attended by a competent woman with quick hands and a thorough knowledge of the relevant medicine, who had, in the intervening months, arranged to receive the medical supplies she required from a trading post in the valley. It was attended by a man who proved, in the hours of that difficult and extraordinary night, to be exactly the kind of steady and unfrightened presence that the situation required, the kind that does not panic and does not minimize and does not need to be managed, only trusted. The child arrived in the grey hour before dawn, which turned out to be a different kind of grey hour than the one those men had used for arriving with harm. This one the colour of new pewter, tender and provisional, full of the sound of the creek beginning to run again under the thinning ice. They named her Margaret, not with grief. With gratitude, and with the understanding that the name was not a memorial but a continuity, the word for a love that had preceded this life and helped create the conditions for it, as all loves ultimately do. The cabin by then had changed further. There was a proper medical shelf with an inventory that Clara kept with the precision and authority of her training. There was a kitchen garden started along the south wall, small but intentional, the beginnings of something that would be larger by summer. There was a cradle by the hearth that Elias had built over the winter, with the same unhurried deliberateness he brought to all construction. Notched pine sanded smooth, with the proportions of something meant to last. Martin Greaves came up in May to see the child, and he sat by the hearth with his hat in his hands, and looked at the three of them with the expression of a man who has seen a great deal of the world and is experiencing a concentration of something worthwhile in this particular cabin, and he said before he left that the valley had been waiting a long time for this. Neither Clara nor Elias asked him what he meant. They understood. The East Meadow bloomed again in July, as it always did. Clara carried Margaret up the slope on that first morning, wrapped against the cool air, and stood at the place where she had set the gold ring the year before. There was nothing there now. The mountain had done what mountains do with small objects left in its soil, and the Indian paintbrush grew thick and indifferent and magnificent right over the spot, and she found she was glad. The ring was gone. The meadow remained. She thought this was, on the whole, the correct resolution. Elias came up the slope behind her with the coffee, as he had the year before, and found her standing in the same place, and he stood beside her and looked out at the same valley, and the child between them was new, and the morning was new, and the mountain was not new at all, ancient and enduring and entirely itself, as it had always been. She leaned her shoulder against his. He leaned back. The Indian paintbrush burned around them in its annual declaration. There are things the wilderness teaches that no other school can offer. It teaches you that the body knows things before the mind admits them, that the instinct to walk toward a thread of smoke in the dark, to move toward warmth rather than away from it, is not weakness but the oldest and most necessary form of wisdom a person carries. It teaches you that a scar is not a diminishment. It is evidence of survival, and survival is always, at some level, a form of courage. It teaches you that silence is not always emptiness, that two people sitting by a fire without speaking can be building something with that silence, something load-bearing, something that will hold weight in the difficult seasons, that a meal shared without ceremony is sometimes more intimate than any declaration, and that the placement of two bowls as a matter of course, without discussion, is its own kind of vow. Clara Ashworth came to the high country, running from a life that had been built on her diminishment, and she found in the place she least expected to find anything, the full dimensions of herself. The nurse's aide with the quick hands, the woman with opinions about organization, and the knowledge of what things are worth. The woman who could build a fire in a trapper's cache at 30 below and think clearly, and document her own injuries with the steady professionalism of someone who understands that truth, recorded precisely, is one of the few defenses that cannot be taken away. Elias Croft came to the high country carrying grief the way the mountain carries its snowfields, patiently, heavily, waiting for the season that would finally allow for release. He had built a second room in October without knowing why, and he had found out why in January. And the knowledge had been, in its way, the most surprising thing the mountain had ever given him. More surprising than the beauty, more surprising than the silence, more surprising than the 3 winters of solitude that had been, he understood now, a preparation rather than a conclusion. The cabin on the eastern ridge became known in the years that followed, in the particular way that places become known in small communities, not through proclamation but through accumulated reference. People spoke of it as a place where someone knew medicine, a place where a lamp was always burning, a place where the welcome, though not loud, was genuine, and where the mountain's terms of honesty were enforced not through harshness, but through example. The valley below remembered, the high peaks remained, and somewhere in a meadow on the east face, in dark mountain soil where the Indian paintbrush grows most thickly, something small and gold is held by the earth, and the earth is indifferent to it, as it is indifferent to all the small expensive symbols of possession that human beings devise. The mountain keeps only what is real. It kept 2 people who had learned, at great cost, to be real with each other. It kept the child they made. It kept the home they built, log by log, in the grammar of necessity and the vocabulary of care. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything. Perhaps you have known a moment like the one Clara had, standing at a threshold, with the wind at your back and the dark ahead, trying to decide whether the warmth you can see in the distance is worth the distance you must walk to reach it. Perhaps you have felt the particular weight of a life that has been slowly, carefully diminished, and the terrifying and necessary decision to walk out through the kitchen door anyway. If you have, then you know that the story does not end at the decision. The decision is only the beginning. What comes after is the harder and more beautiful work, the work of learning again the dimensions of your own worth, and finding, if you are fortunate, someone who does not require your diminishment in order to feel their own size. If this story spoke to something in you, if Clara's courage or Elias's quiet steadiness or the mountain's hard and generous truth found you where you are, we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell us, which moment in this journey moved you most? Was it the night she came to the fence, or the morning of the meadow, or something quieter? A bowl placed on a table, a silence that held weight. And if you believe, as we do, that the most important stories are the ones about people finding their way home to themselves, please share this journey. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story from the high country, where the cold is real, and the warmth is earned, and the best things are built from whatever survives the hardest seasons. We thank you for listening. May you find your own East Meadow. May it be in bloom when you arrive.